Are you ready to order, sir?
Yes, I'll have the ribeye, medium rare.
Excellent choice. I have a secret. Your life is in danger.
Who are you?
Your reputation is at stake.
Tell me everything.
The note took barely 10 seconds to write. 10 seconds that curdled the expensive wine in the glasses, silenced the laughter of the three lieutenants at the table, and turned a routine dinner service into a moment that could never be taken back. Renee Washington felt the change instantly. The air in the VIP booth grew heavy and static, as if the restaurant's velvet curtains were closing in to trap them all. She had barely clicked her pen shut before the world stopped moving. She stood there, poised and professional, her server's apron crisp and her expression a mask of practiced calm. She was ready to walk away, ready to fade back into the shadows of the kitchen. But the man at the head of the table didn't look away, didn't bark an order, and didn't reach for his holster. Jang Woo-sung sat there, a sharp-suited monolith of iron and secrets, his body casting a long, dark shadow over the white linen tablecloth. His presence was suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress, hands large and scarred, resting on the table with a weight that suggested he owned the ground beneath the building. It was a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout because its silence was a death sentence. Renee's steady hand twitched. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had overplayed her hand, if the ghost of O'Day Sick had led her into a trap she couldn't escape. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice lower and steadier than the pounding of her heart. Woo-sung's eyes finally rose from the guest check to her face, dark, piercing, and suddenly shimmering with an agonizing light. They didn't threaten. They didn't burn. They searched her face with a raw, desperate vulnerability, as if she were the only person in the city who could see the man behind the monster. Then, as the lieutenants watched in stunned horror, the first tear fell. Renee's presence at the Gilded Lily had always been defined by a specific kind of invisibility. To the titans of industry and the shadows of the underworld who frequented the velvet booths, she was merely an extension of the silver service, a ghost in a starched apron who moved with the silent efficiency of clockwork. But while they saw nothing when they looked at her, Renee saw everything. She had learned the art of the red from O'Day Sick. Before he became the frail, forgotten man she spent her Sunday mornings caring for, Day-Sick had been the institutional memory of the Russo-Korean alliance. He was a man who had survived 4 decades in a world of wolves by noticing the things others ignored. In the final year of his life, tucked away in a cramped apartment that smelled of liniment and jasmine tea, he had passed those eyes on to Renee. "Watch their hands, Renee," he would wheeze, his fingers trembling as he gripped his teacup. A man can lie with his tongue. He can even lie with his eyes if he is practiced enough. But his hands? They tell the truth of his soul. He taught her that a man who constantly adjusts his cufflinks is insecure, seeking armor in his wealth. A man who keeps his palms flat on the table is ready to exert control, while one who hides them beneath the wood is harboring a betrayal. Through Day-Sick's stories, Jang Woo-sung had been transformed from a distant, terrifying myth into a human being. Day-Sick spoke of a younger Woo-sung, a boy who had once loved the sound of the cello and held a fierce, protective devotion to a sister the world had forced him to forget. "He has a hole in his heart the size of a mountain," Day-Sick had whispered shortly before he passed. "He thinks he has filled it with concrete and blood. He is wrong." Back in the present, as Renee stood before the sobbing Mafia Boss, she realized she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the curator of a ghost's legacy. She watched Woo-sung's hands, the way they shook as he pressed a napkin to his face. For the first time, the man of stone wasn't flat-palmed and dominant. His fingers were curled inward, clutching at the linen as if it were the only thing keeping him from drowning in the middle of his own empire. The lieutenants began to stir, their confusion sharpening into a dangerous, jagged edge. They looked at Renee not as a ghost, but as a threat. But Renee didn't flinch. She remembered day 6's final lesson. Once you see the man behind the monster can no longer frighten you. She had reached into the concrete of Woo-sung's heart and found the source. Now, there was no going back. The silence following the fallout of the first tier was more violent than any shout. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the VIP booth. To the 3 men flanking Jang Woo-sung, the sight of their boss, a man who had presided over the harshest winters of the Seoul underworld without flinching, breaking down over a scrap of paper, was an impossibility. It was a breach in the fortress, and to them, Renee was the architect of that structural failure. The lieutenant to Woo-sung's left, a man with a jagged scar running into his hairline and eyes like flint, was the first to move. He surged out of his seat, the silk of his suit jacket straining against his broad shoulders. In one swift, practiced motion, his hand closed around Renee's upper arm, his grip like a vice. "What did you put in this?" he hissed, his voice a low, lethal rasp. His free hand reached for the guest check, while his other associate stood, his hand reaching inside his blazer in a gesture that made the air turn cold. "What kind of game is this? You think you can poison his mind and walk away?" Renee didn't struggle. She didn't let the terror rising in her throat reach her eyes. She remained as she had been, poised, professional, and anchored by the memory of day 6's steady voice. She looked the lieutenant in the eye, her silence a shield. "Let her go." The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of a falling axe. The lieutenant froze. "Boss, she's clearly—" "I said," Woo-sung repeated, his voice cracking slightly but regaining its iron edge. "Let her go." The grip on Renee's arm vanished instantly. The lieutenants recoiled, looking at their leader in stunned disbelief. Woo-sung slowly lowered the napkin. His eyes were bloodshot, the rims raw and red, stripping away the decades of practiced intimidation. He looked at Renee, and for a moment, the restaurant, the bodyguards, and the empire simply ceased to exist. He stood up, his massive frame towering over her, but he didn't lean in to threaten. He reached out, his hand trembling as he held up the guest check. The single name written there, the name of a sister lost to the shadows 20 years ago, seemed to pulse between them. "Where?" Woo-sung breathed, the word caught in his throat. "Where did you get this information? Who gave you this name?" Renee took a slow, measured breath, sensing the desperate hunger for the truth behind his demand. "A man who never forgot you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant clatter of the kitchen. "A man you left behind, who died holding on to the only secret that could still make you human." Woo-sung's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He looked at her as if she were a ghost herself, his gaze searching for a lie she wasn't telling. "Tell me everything," he commanded, though it sounded more like a plea. "Not here, not like this, but you're not going anywhere until I know the rest." The tension in the Gilded Lily didn't dissipate after Woo-sung's departure. It simply migrated, settling like a thick, toxic fog in the corridors between the kitchen and the dining room. Renee felt the weight of it in the way the other staff avoided her gaze, and she felt it most acutely in the trembling hands of Tyler Grant. Tyler was barely 19, a kid with wide eyes and a scholarship dream that was currently being crushed under the heels of his heavy work boots. He was a busboy who tried to remain invisible, but in a world governed by men like Woo-sung, even a shadow can trip over the wrong feet. The mistake happened in a heartbeat. Tyler, hurried and harried by the sharp barks of the head waiter, had turned a corner too sharply. A tray of crystal stemware collided with the chest of a man who had stayed behind, one of Woo-sung's lower-level enforcers, a man named Min-ho, who lacked his boss's burgeoning restraint. The crash of glass was a physical blow. Expensive red wine bloomed across Min-ho's white shirt like a fresh wound. By the time Renee reached them, Min-ho had Tyler by the throat, pinning him against the industrial refrigerator. Tyler's feet dangled inches from the floor, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs, you little rat? Minho hissed, his fist pulled back. I should carve the price of it out of your hide. Stop. Renee's voice didn't shake, though her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. Minho sneered, not loosening his grip. Back off, waitress. This isn't your table. No, Renee said, stepping into the enforcer's personal space, invoking the only shield she had. But your boss is waiting for me to finish my shift. He's waiting for answers that only I have. Do you think he'll be patient if he finds out you've turned his favorite restaurant into a crime scene? Or worse, that you've touched something or someone I care about? It was a gamble, a desperate use of an influence she hadn't yet earned. She watched Minho's eyes, seeing the calculation. He looked at the red wine on his shirt, then at Renee's unwavering stare, and finally at the door where Woo-sung's shadow still seemed to linger. Slowly, with a look of pure malice, he opened his hand. Tyler slumped to the floor, gasping for air, his eyes streaming with tears of terror. He's a clumsy kid, Renee said, her voice softening as she placed herself between the two men. I'll handle the cleanup, and I'll make sure the boss knows you showed professional discretion. Minho spat on the tile near Tyler's hand. Make sure he knows, he warned before turning on his heel and disappearing into the night. Renee knelt beside Tyler, pulling the shaking boy into a brief, fierce embrace. She had saved him for tonight, but as she looked toward the darkened dining room, she realized the stakes had shifted. She wasn't just a messenger anymore. She was a protector, and to keep Tyler safe, she would have to walk even deeper into Jang Woo-sung's fire. The summons didn't arrive via a formal invitation, but through the absence of sound. When Renee arrived for her shift the following evening, the Gilded Lily was empty, not closed but cleared. The usual hum of the elite had been replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. At the center of the room, far from the shared booths, a single table had been set with silver and bone china. Jang Woo-sung was already there. He wasn't at the head of the table. He sat to the side, leaving the chair opposite him pulled out in a silent command. Tonight, Renee, the menu is irrelevant, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the hollow room. He didn't look up as she approached, his gaze fixed on a vintage bottle of Bordeaux that had already been decanted. Seat, please. Renee hesitated for only a second before she unknotted her apron. She draped it over the back of an empty chair at a nearby station, shedding her identity as a servant with a single, fluid motion. When she sat across from him, the shift in the atmosphere was physical. For the first time, they were eye to eye, stripped of the barrier of the guest check and the serving tray. Woo-sung poured 2 glasses, his hands steady now, though the redness remained around his eyes, a permanent mark of the previous night's upheaval. My men tell me you have a protective streak, he remarked, sliding a glass toward her. Minho is still nursing a bruised ego after being lectured by a waitress. I was protecting your reputation, Mr. Jang, Renee replied, her voice cool and level. A man in your position shouldn't be known for bullying children in kitchens. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Dasik always said you were sharper than a razor. He wrote about you in his letters. The woman who brought him tea and listened to the ramblings of a dying man when his own family wouldn't answer the phone. He leaned back, the shadows of the room carving deep lines into his face. He began to talk, not of territory or profit, but of the old days, a time when the organization was built on blood oaths rather than spreadsheets. He spoke of a city that no longer existed and a sister whose name had been a forbidden prayer in his household. As he spoke, the power dynamic pivoted. Woo-sung wasn't the hunter tonight. He was a man lost in a forest of his own making, looking to Renee to find the path back. He wasn't giving orders, he was offering confessions. I built all of this, he said, gesturing to the opulent room, to ensure no one could ever take anything from me again. But in doing so, I've become a man who has nothing left to lose. He looked at her, his expression raw. Dasik knew that, and he knew you were the only one brave enough to tell me. The wine in Renee's glass remained untouched, catching the amber light of the chandelier like a trapped eye. She watched Woo-sung, seeing the way his expensive suit seemed to hang heavier on his frame as the memories of the old days settled in the room. It was time to pull back the final curtain. You speak of Dasik as a legend, a pillar of your organization, Renee said, her voice cutting through the quiet with a sharp, clinical edge. But I didn't meet a legend. I met a man who was dying in a room that smelled of damp wallpaper and cheap tea. A man who had to choose between buying heart medication or paying his heating bill. Woo-sung's hand, which had been reaching for the decanter, stilled. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was jagged, uncomfortable. The organization provides for its own, he said, though the words sounded hollow, a rehearsed line from a script he no longer believed in. Dasik was retired with honor. There were accounts, provisions. There were excuses, Renee countered, her eyes locking onto his. Your lieutenants told you he was fine. They told you he wanted to be left alone. But the truth is, they let him fade because a man who remembers the old ways is a mirror they didn't want to look into. They didn't want to be reminded of what happens to a loyal soldier when his hands start to shake. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. I was the one who held his hand when the fever took him. Not a bodyguard, not a brother from the family. Me, a waitress who lived across the hall and couldn't stand the sound of his coughing through the thin walls. He spent his last months talking to me because no one else would listen. He told me about the boy who loved the cello. He told me about the sister you failed to protect, and the guilt that became the foundation of this entire empire. Woo-sung closed his eyes, his jaw working as he fought to maintain the mask of the Mafia Boss. But the mask was cracked. He died penniless, Woo-sung, she said, using his name without the title for the first time. But he died loving you. He gave me that note because he knew you were suffocating under the weight of people who only love your power. He wanted to give you back your soul, even if it meant breaking your heart to do it. A single, sharp intake of breath was the only sound Woo-sung made. He looked down at his large, powerful hands, the hands that controlled the city, and for the first time he saw them as Dasik had, as tools that had built a magnificent, lonely cage. The stillness of the gilded lily was a deceptive veneer, hiding the tectonic plates of power as they began to grind and fracture. While Jang Woo-sung sat in the hollowed-out silence of his own restaurant, staring into the ghost of his past, the machinery of his empire was already turning against him. In the back rooms and the smoke-filled leather booths of private clubs, the air was thick with the scent of sedition. The lieutenants, men who had been forged in the crucible of Woo-sung's cold logic, now found that logic replaced by a terrifying emotional erraticism. To them, the Order of Tears hadn't been a moment of redemption. It had been a declaration of bankruptcy. They whispered in the dark, their voices low and jagged with resentment. Minho, still nursing the humiliation of the kitchen encounter and the wine stain on his pride, was the loudest among them. He's compromised, Minho hissed, leaning over a table in a dimly lit basement bar across town. A waitress, a girl who serves soup, is now the keeper of his conscience. He's looking for ghosts when he should be looking at the docks. The rivals in the north are smelling blood. They don't see a dragon anymore. They see a man who cries into his napkins. The other men nodded, their faces grim under the flickering yellow light. For decades, the Russo-Korean alliance had been held together by the certainty that Woo-sung was a man without a pressure point. Now, Renee Washington was a glaring vulnerability, a soft target that had turned their leader inward. The consensus was swift and brutal. The machine could not function with a heart. If he won't cut the weakness out himself, the senior-most lieutenant murmured, his fingers tracing the rim of shot glass with lethal precision, then the family must do it for him. We restore strength by removing the distraction. And if the boss stands in the way of that restoration, then perhaps the boss has outlived his utility. They began to map the cracks. They noted the times Renee arrived for her shift, the security gaps she left as she walked Tyler home, and the way Woo-sung's private security had been thinned out to watch over her instead of him. It was a classic coup built on the oldest grievance in the world, the fear that a leader had become human. Renee felt the eyes on her the next day. The red that Day-Sick had taught her was screaming. The shadows in the restaurant weren't just decorative anymore. They were watching. Every click of a lighter, every rustle of a silk suit, sounded like a fuse being lit. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was preparing to shatter, and she was the fault line. She looked at Woo-sung across the dining room, seeing a man finally waking up, unaware that his awakening had signaled the start of a war. The tension that had been brewing in the shadows finally boiled over in the early hours before the restaurant opened. Renee arrived to find the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Lily unlocked, the interior bathed in a sickly, cold fluorescent light from the kitchen. In the center of the dining floor, the tables had been pushed aside to create a hollow, expectant circle. Minho was on his knees, his face a map of bruises, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Standing over him was Jang Woo-sung, his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the coiled strength of his forearms. In his right hand, he held a heavy, silenced pistol. The other lieutenants stood in a semicircle, their faces impassive, waiting for the ritual of blood that would prove their leader's heart hadn't turned to glass. He was the one, Woo-sung said, his voice a low, vibrating hum as he looked at Renee. He didn't turn his head. He was the one whispering in the dark. He was the one who thought my grief was a vacancy for his ambition. The law of the family is clear, Renee. Treason is paid for an iron. Woo-sung raised the weapon, the barrel coming to rest against Minho's forehead. The enforcer closed his eyes, his bravado replaced by a ragged, desperate whimpering. Wait! Renee stepped into the circle. The lieutenants shifted, their hands moving instinctively toward their waistbands, but a sharp glance from Woo-sung froze them. Renee walked until she was inches from the gun, her presence a soft, defiant contrast to the lethality of the room. You think this proves you're strong? She asked, her voice steady despite the hammer pulse in her throat. Killing him just feeds the machine. It's the easy way, Woo-sung. It's the way that kept Day-Sick in that damp apartment until he died alone. You want to be a man who is feared or a man who is followed? He tried to destroy us, Woo-sung hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. If I don't do this, the others will see it as a green light for their own daggers. Then change the light, Renee countered. She looked down at Minho, then back to Woo-sung. Day-Sick told me that the greatest power you ever had wasn't your fist. It was your word. Strip him of his rank. Take his assets. Exile him to the same life of nothingness that he forced on his elders. Let him live with the knowledge that he wasn't worth a bullet. That is justice. This, she gestured to the gun, this is just more concrete for the hole in your heart. The silence stretched, agonizing and thin. Woo-sung's chest heaved, the war between the monster and the man playing out in the taut muscles of his jaw. Slowly, almost painfully, he lowered the pistol. He didn't look at the lieutenants. He looked only at Renee. Get him out of my sight, Woo-sung commanded. He is dead to this family. If he is seen in this city by sunrise, the mercy ends. As the men dragged a sobbing Minho away, Woo-sung stood alone in the center of the room, the weapon heavy in his hand. He looked at Renee, a strange, terrifying clarity in his eyes. He had chosen mercy, but in doing so, he had officially declared war on the only world he had ever known. The silence of the Gilded Lily didn't break, it shattered. It happened just as the streetlights hummed to life outside, casting long, amber ribs across the dining room floor. Renee was adjusting the silver at a corner table while Tyler polished the glassware nearby, the rhythmic clinking the only sound in the room. Then the front windows exploded. A hail of high-caliber rounds shredded the velvet curtains and turned the heavy oak tables into splinters. "Down!" Renee screamed, lunging for Tyler and tackling him behind the thick marble slab of the service bar. Jang Woo-sung was across the room, caught in the open. He dived behind a toppled mahogany table, his silhouette illuminated by the rhythmic muzzle flashes from a street. This wasn't a warning. It was an erasure. The rival factions, emboldened by the whispers of a weakened boss, had come to finish what the dissenters had started. "Tyler, stay low and crawl toward the kitchen exit. Don't look back," Renee commanded, her voice a sharp, jagged blade of steel. She didn't wait for his answer. Through the chaos of smoke and falling plaster, she saw Woo-sung pinned down. He was reaching for his weapon, but a spray of bullets kept him pressed against the floor, glass raining down on his sharp suit like diamond dust. Renee saw the shooter, a shadow moving through the shattered storefront, stepping over the threshold with a shotgun leveled at Woo-sung's position. She didn't have a gun, but she had the red. She knew the kitchen's layout, and she knew the weight of the heavy copper cookware hanging just above the bar. With a burst of speed that defied the terror in her veins, she grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet and a pressurized CO2 canister used for the soda lines. As the assassin stepped closer to Woo-sung, Renee slammed the canister against the marble edge and rolled it across the floor. The hiss of escaping gas created a localized cloud of white frost, blinding the shooter for a crucial second. In that heartbeat of confusion, Renee swung the skillet with every ounce of her strength, the metal connecting with the man's temple with a sickening crack. The shooter went down, but more were coming. Renee scrambled through the smoke, reaching Woo-sung. She grabbed his hand, her grip warm and solid against his cold, bloodied palm. "The service tunnel," she breathed, her eyes locking onto his. "Daesik told me the old floor plans. There's a way out through the wine cellar." Woo-sung looked at her, the waitress who had brought him to tears, now standing in the middle of a war zone with the calm of a general. He didn't question her. He rose, pulling his weapon, and followed her into the dark. For the first time in his life, the Mafia Boss wasn't leading the charge. He was being led toward the light by the only person who saw him as worth saving. The safe house was a stark departure from the gilded opulence of the restaurant. It was a place of concrete and shadows, hidden in the industrial guts of the city where the air tasted of salt and old machinery. Jang Woo-sung sat on a low, wooden bench, his pristine white shirt now a ruin of soot and drying blood. Renee moved with quiet purpose, her hand steady as she pressed a cool, damp cloth against a jagged graze on his temple. The silence between them wasn't the suffocating pressure of the VIP booth. It was the heavy, exhausted stillness that follows a storm. Tyler was asleep in the adjacent room, safe and tucked away from the carnage they had barely escaped. "You should have left me there," Woo-sung said, his voice a gravelly whisper. He didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the floor as if studying the cracks in the cement. The lieutenants were right. "I'll become a liability. A king who stops to cry is just a man waiting for his crown to be taken." Renee didn't stop her work. She rinsed the cloth, the water blooming pink in the basin. "A king who can't feel isn't a leader, Woo-sung. He's just a statue. And statues are easy to topple." He let out a short, bitter breath that sounded like a sob caught in his throat. Slowly, he looked up at her, the mask of the Mafia Boss completely gone. In its place was the boy who had loved the cello, the brother who had lost his sister, and the man who had been haunted by a ghost in a damp apartment. "That night at the table, when I read the note," he began, his voice trembling. "It wasn't just the name. It was the realization that for 20 years, I haven't been living. I've been building a monument to my own numbness. I thought that if I became a monster, the world couldn't hurt me anymore. But Daesik, he saw through it. And You looked at me like I was still human. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he pulled back, as if afraid his touch would contaminate her. Those tears weren't for the loss of my power. They were for the 20 years I spent pretending I didn't have a heart. I was finally letting the monster die, Renee, and it hurt more than any bullet. Renee set the cloth aside and did what no one in his world would ever dare to do. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his scarred, powerful grip. She didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances of his strength. She simply held him in the dark. "The monster is dead," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the gloom. "But the man is still here. And for the first time, he has something worth fighting for that isn't just an empire." Woo-sung leaned his forehead against her shoulder, his shoulders finally dropping as the last of the iron tension left his body. He wasn't a boss or a legend in that moment. He was just a man, finally home. The Gilded Lily reopened its doors on a crisp autumn evening, but the air inside was different. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced with sheer, light-filtering fabrics, and the oppressive silence of the VIP booths had transitioned into a warm, melodic hum. The restaurant was no longer a fortress for the shadows. It was a sanctuary for the city. Renee stood at the center of the dining room, her posture as poised as ever, but she no longer wore the starched apron of Ghost. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that commanded the room without raising a voice. As the new manager and partial owner, she moved through the floor with a quiet authority that earned her a new title among the regulars and the staff: the Queen of the Gilded Lily. She was the heart of the establishment, the one who ensured that no one, from the high-ranking officials to the youngest busboys, was ever made to feel invisible again. Tyler Grant was there too, no longer a trembling boy in oversized boots. He moved with confidence, his tuition secured, and his future no longer a gamble. He looked toward Renee with a smile of deep-seated gratitude, a living testament to the different kind of power she had introduced to the world of Jang Woo-sung. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. There was no sudden hush of terror, no reaching for concealed weapons. Instead, there was a respectful nod from the staff as a man in a soft cashmere overcoat stepped inside. Jang Woo-sung didn't sit in the back anymore. He walked to a small, sun-drenched table near the window, the same one where Renee had once stood with a trembling heart and a guest check. He sat down, his hands resting flat and relaxed on the white linen, no longer curled into defensive fists. The man of stone had softened into a man of depth. He still ran his empire, but he ran it with the memory of Haute Day-Sick in his mind and the clarity of Renee's mercy in his soul. Renee approached him, not as a servant, but as a partner. She didn't need to take an order. She already knew what he required. She sat across from him, and for a long moment, they simply shared the peace they had fought a war to achieve. "The new menu is a success," Woo-sung remarked, his voice warm and steady, the cold gray of his eyes replaced by a soft, enduring light. "It's because it's honest," Renee replied, her hand reaching across the table to find his. Woo-sung squeezed her fingers, looking out at the city he once ruled through fear and now served through a newfound humanity. He was a man who had lost his crown of iron only to find a life of gold. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a glow over the Gilded Lily, it was clear that the Order of Tears hadn't been an ending. It had been the first line of a brand new story, one where love hadn't just saved a man, but had finally, irrevocably, led him home.